Welcome to Peer Check. I'm your host, Adam Keating, and today we're talking about the changes that are happening in engineering design collaboration and what's actually making engineers happy and productive. My guest today is Dr. Alison Olechowski, MIT Queen's engineer, leading the Ready Lab at the University of Toronto as an assistant professor and doing some absolutely incredible research and user studies to help us figure out what we need to do going forward to be better. Alison, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Adam. Fun to be here.
So Alison, I want to get right into just what is the Ready Lab and why did it become so focused on engineering collaboration? How did that all come about?
Sure. Well, the Ready Lab is my research group at the University of Toronto. So I really love being a professor. It's pretty cool the amount of autonomy you get, and so I built the Ready Lab as a center to study engineering design collaboration. So that means that I hire grad students who come in to get their masters and their PhDs, and they do research under my supervision. And then we generate papers and insight, and we try to share it with the world. And so how it came to be is that I've always been interested in collaboration. I guess I've always been interested in design. And many folks study design in many different ways. When I was starting out as a professor, I had to try to find a topic that I thought was interesting and compelling and had a bunch of research questions associated with it, like something that we weren't really certain about how it works. And as I explored different topics, I kept coming back to collaboration. Partly because the products that really matter these days are just increasingly complex, and so we can't design them on our own. We need more people. And then secondly, I was just feeling like we have great tools for specific domains. That's kind of not old news, but we've really figured that out. And what's sort of bottlenecking design is the interfaces between people, between domains, for example. So broadly speaking, yeah, my lab looks at engineering design, but a lot of our projects are looking to improve the way designers collaborate with each other when they're designing their products.
I'm going to say thank you right off the hop for actually diving into this, because I think lots of people know it's not great and lots of people know there's lots of challenges and opportunities, but very few are actually putting, rubber hitting the road here and actually figuring out what needs to be done. And it's a place that I think, like you said, there's so much investment in, how people build software. And there's an opportunity now for people building physical products and complex products to really accelerate that pace. I think it's super cool that there's some actual real tangible insight on the other side of that. So I'm really interested. You're releasing tons of papers, tons of insights every year. It seems like your students are incredible, based on what I can tell from reading the work they're doing. I'm curious, just off the hop, focus a lot on collaboration. What's sort of your initial gut reaction to the research over the last 3, 4, 5 years? Give us sort of the synopsis of what you're seeing broadly happen in the industry.
Sure. Well, I think it's a super interesting time to be studying collaboration for a bunch of reasons. So one is that researchers have been talking about collaboration for 40 years now, especially when it comes to engineering. But only in the past few years has the internet become so ubiquitous and computers have become so powerful that collaboration is becoming much more practical at scale. And I'm sure you guys know this at CoLab too. We used to talk about distributed teams as sort of an exception. Now, especially if we factor COVID in and sort of the natural experiment that the world went through in terms of working virtually in distributed teams, it's just so much more common. And so I think what's really been interesting in the past few years in terms of research studies is, I'll say I think everything's interesting because we're just starting to describe the differences between collaboratively working and working by yourself. I think the default for so long when it came to looking at the way engineers design is to imagine them really designing by themselves in a cubicle, on a computer workstation that's not well connected. And so there's just so much to be learned about what happens when we collaborate more seamlessly, I guess, which can be really cool because we can draw on findings from different fields. So, for example, if we look
Hmm.
at psychology research, it tells us that like humans are generally more engaged in their work when they are working with someone else. Like that's true generally in work. Before some
Hmm.
of our studies, it's never been really looked at specifically in engineering, but we thought like, engineers are unique, but not that unique. It's got to be true here
Yeah.
too. There's
Yeah.
studies in other fields that say like when you work on a team, you can be more creative. Like that should be true in engineering too. Or maybe you can discover more errors more quickly. Again, that should be true in engineering. And so it's been just neat to kind of scratch the surface of exploring these principles from other fields, but in the context of engineering design.
Hmm. It's funny too because a lot of those things have like small nuances on the engineering front. I think that's where like the really interesting insight happens. Like I remember you telling me ages ago about this study you did where you actually watched the emotions of somebody collaborating with someone while doing CAD design. I think it was an on-shape study at the time. And you were saying like you could see they were happier. And like happier is like a thing that isn't measured in the engineering field very often. Whereas you look at a software company, ENPS, like truly like employee net promoter score, is one of the most fundamental things people measure. You go to an engineering org, like that's not what's being talked about. We're actually talking about retention problems and attracting talent, but we're not like tying the two things together that like people aren't happy. So like that's why they're leaving and not coming. And it's like there's so much there to kind of unpack. I'm curious like on just like the new generation of CAD, you look particularly on shapes and I think about even in the design world, right? We use Figma every day. We live in Slack, we live in Teams, live in Notion. Everything's kind of real time together. What's been some of the big takeaways from seeing engineers transition from, a classical desktop CAD to something that is more real time, collaborative, and gets people feeling like they're actually working together?
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll talk about that study that you mentioned where we had we did a user study. So we had designers come into our lab and we randomly assigned them to one of two treatments, we would call it, either working on the CAD task by themselves or working on the CAD task with a partner. And you're right, we used Onshape for that study, and we were able to record not only the screen that they were working on to kind of see what clicks they were making in CAD, but also their faces. And we used a technology called facial emotion recognition to look at their emotion as they were CADing up. It was actually a toy car that we asked them to design, and then we could sort of match those two data sets, so emotion with what they were doing in CAD. And you kind of already talked about some of the most interesting findings, which is just to say that CADing with someone else was, in general, a more highly emotional experience. And you're right that the nuances of CAD matter here. So something that was quite interesting was it's more highly emotional when it comes to positive emotions, but also negative emotions. Like I know you're a guy who's done a lot of CAD. We've all
Yeah.
trained in CAD in our own singular workspace, working by ourselves, totally in control. Um,
Hmm.
we know we know our own ways of CADing, and then our participants came in and were using Onshape, which is like a multi-tenant CAD environment where someone else can be in there making changes in the same way in a Google Docs it could happen, and they could be
Yeah.
actually breaking your
Yeah.
tree, for example, or making changes you weren't expecting. So we saw some negative emotion, but we also saw a lot of positive emotion, which is pretty cool because the research says that we should see positive emotion when we're working with someone else, but it says that working through a computer will mediate that. So, like the most highly engaging positive experiences face to face, and
Hmm.
it kind of lessens as we go through a computer. But our study showed like it doesn't dampen it that much. We still have highly positive emotional experience when we're working through a computer. And we just saw some like funny anecdotes from our participants. Like they would be chatting and they would be making jokes to each other.
Yeah.
A funny thing we noticed was, our jokes make our partners laugh, but we also really like to laugh at our own jokes, which is kind of funny. It's true.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that was a really neat study where I think we kind of let two worlds collide. Like for some reason, we're not that used to talking about emotion in the engineering
Hmm.
world. But you're absolutely right in what you mentioned. Like we should be thinking about the engagement and the emotion of our designers, keeping them happy, making sure they're learning and having fun. I think in most
Yeah.
engineering cultures, that's something that we're looking for.
It's interesting because you hear so much about companies talking about having a hard time retaining employees, you have a hard time attracting employees. I'm starting to even now hear in corporate, Fortune 500 reports that like one of their big initiatives is to attract the next generation into their company. And it's like that is such a different you never heard that 10 years, you never heard that 5 years ago, but it's honestly like an existential threat to everyone shifting away from mechanical engineering because candidly a lot of it's 10, 20 years old versus software is like every 5 minutes something new is happening, and the way you live your daily life, you're living in these softwares, right? Just think about how we're talking. We're on a video call together from Toronto to St. John's. We're talking over text message. We're on video call. We're on Slack. Wherever we are, and then you go in to do your actual job, and it's a tool from like 1980 that hasn't felt like it's changed at all. You're by yourself. That doesn't feel very good, and I think the next generation of people are seeing it. And honestly, people that are in the workforce 10, 15 years are starting to now say, well, I'm used to teams and I'm used to the rest and that connected nature. And I think COVID also made us all a lot more human, too. When you think about the emotional side, it became okay to talk about how you're feeling. And, we've seen it too. Like the word fun, I don't think I would have ever tried to describe a tool in the engineering space as fun before, but like I can see it being fun going into Onshape, or even like when we've had users using Colab and going through and like just be able to see each other talk in real time in context of something engineering related is so foreign
Yeah, you
to the
don't.
world.
Yeah, you don't want to be working in a void, right? You want to be getting feedback. You want to be learning from your colleagues. Like, I think it just makes sense, and we should be helping our designers be getting there more easily. Yeah.
Yeah, and the interesting part too is I think the negative emotions actually good. Like if you think about whenever you use Google Docs the first time, I remember like these crazy highs of like, okay, great, I don't have to send this file around, and these crazy lows of like, wow, this is so slow because there's 8 of us editing this document at once. Those like they mellow out a little bit, but I think it stays skewed high long term. And you see the same with these tools. I bet you if that study had perpetuated on for 3 or 4 months where you get used to tendencies and people get comfortable, I bet you it nullifies some of the negative consequences. It'd be a really cool study to actually run long term to
It
see
would be. Yeah.
what actually comes out of that.
Yeah, true. And
Um,
and Adam, I will say that you have good psychology instincts because psychologists would say that it's not it's not like we need to minimize negative emotions and maximize positive emotions. Like if we think about what the designer needs in their outputs, like positive emotions tend to associate with creative thinking and sort of like a peacefulness and a clarity of thought. But negative emotions, studies have shown, can make you really dig into a problem and try to solve a problem in more detail. And so, like, as you said, those frustrations can also kind of spur on a certain behavior that can be useful for design.
yeah, and I mean, I'm definitely not a psychology expert, but I'm willing to probably bet my entire annual salary here that if you looked at where that negative emotion actually is in traditional CAD, it's just not in the tool. It's in a meeting 3 weeks later when the work you did was completely a waste of time, or someone else did it, or the thing crashed. Like it happens, but it just didn't happen there because you were at peace, like you said, right? You were at peace for that moment. I think it's actually good to break things quicker. It's the whole philosophy of agile, but for engineering, and it's like I think that's a good thing. It's smaller bumps of like, little drops versus getting to the end of the project and being like, wow, that was a complete waste of time. And we're going to rewrite this entire CAD model. And you're like, that emotion is the type of emotion people leave teams and companies over. So you had a second paper there in the mix of all that. It was titled, Are two Heads Better Than One for Computer Aided Design? What's sort of the takeaway? Like, is it two? Is it four? Is it one? Like, what's the actual optimal team size? We're working on like one integrated, part or assembly.
Okay, well, great question, and we don't have the answer yet because, like, partly practically speaking, it's hard for us to recruit these mega teams, but we would
Yeah.
we would love to. So we really only compared our two heads better than one, and what we found there um, is that two heads are not absolutely better than one head, and one head is not absolutely better than two heads. So let's say that you are just looking at speed of CAD. One person working by themselves can finish a CAD model quicker than two people working together if we kind of normalize by people, right?
Hmm.
So the funny thing is, like, often we're actually in reality trying to hit a deadline. We wouldn't be allowing just one person to work quickly by themselves. We actually need more people to work on the CAD model. So it's not really a fair comparison in that way. But if we
Hmm.
say like amount of CAD completed per person, one person is faster than two people. That's because when you have two people doing any task, right off the bat, they have to communicate a little bit and coordinate a little bit, and that takes some time. On the flip side, I think that investment is worth it because what our study did find was that two people end up generating higher quality CAD, so with fewer errors, um, and that's I think really important. And kind of to your point earlier, um, if we're gaining time in the end
Hmm.
if we're generating CAD that is higher quality. So yeah, that's the trade-off that we found: time and quality.
It's interesting because, like, when you think about it, the time nugget you're talking about there is like this little finite pocket of time versus like time to market, which if you're making quality mistakes the whole way along the way, each one of those is, exasperates like whatever difference in time you would have spent avoiding it. Like there's like a 10x multiplier on that, and it's tricky to like understand that because it's apples to oranges until it's time to market, which is tricky. Or on the other side, actually a change happening once it's in market. Then you're talking about dollar signs, and it's the same kind of thing. I'm curious from like each of these studies you've done in the last couple of years, um, where do you see the biggest opportunity for improvement? In the short term, I think over the next 5 or 10 years, you're going to see a lot of things all become cloud and connected and a whole different ecosystem. But where do you see improvement in the short term for
Hmm.
engineering teams?
That's an interesting question. Um, so I will say that something that we notice in all of the experiments where we're pairing people together is
Hmm.
that it's a very um, different experience. Like what I'm realizing is that often we learn to CAD and it's such a singular experience that we do it our way and we don't really get insight into how other people do it. And
Hmm.
what I've realized is that benefit of designing collaboratively is getting to see how other people approach a problem and get like learning tips and tricks from others. And so if we kind of try to extrapolate from that, I think a tip would be to try to get your engineers talking about process a little bit more and learning from each other when it comes to process. We've taken a lot of inspiration in our work from software and like pair programming, for example.
Hmm.
And there you get to, like, sure, again, studies have shown that pair programmers are a little bit slower, but it's a really satisfying and engaging experience for the designers. Again, the code has fewer errors,
Hmm.
and it leads to real learning. And so I think it's one of those things where sure it sacrifices a little bit of productivity, but in the end, I think letting your engineers take some time to pair up and sort of apprentice from each other um, can help them hone their craft and learn from each other and get better.
Yeah, I think it's such a valuable thing. Like we see it all the time with our software teams, like how much they're sharing that knowledge. And I think back to when I was doing, CAD, I was doing SolidWorks most of the time. I would always end up with like the model I needed. I definitely did it in like the worst way possible, just about every single time. And it was always because I was in a time crunch and never really thinking future facing. And a part of that was because I did most of this as internships and short term things or startups or whatever. But that's no way to go build something complex because it just comes back to rewriting it, redoing it, doing the same thing over and over again. And I think that's what like we see with our software team today. We're always thinking about how do you abstract this away? How do you make something that's reusable and extensible? Like you're always having that conversation. I think it happens in engineering now too. Like more mature companies definitely have it, but there's parts that you can do on like the micro scale to educate each other better. I think that has a long lasting impact, and that kind of segues nicely into what I want to chat about next. And it's like you think about collaborative engineering design. We've been using the term co-design, and it's something that you can see in the design world in general. What does that mean to you? Like when you hear co-design, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, so I'll be a little professorial in answering this in that there's like co-design has a definition in the mechanical engineering design world, which is sort of like participatory design. And so it's actually used a lot in the context of like designing a service and making
Mm-hmm.
sure that you are involving your users in the design process. What it means to me is, I think, fundamentally a little more broad, which is just a reminder to us as designers that it's not it's not all on us to design the artifact. And so, how can I say that a little better? It's just, yeah, reminding us that we have access to users, we have access to stakeholders, and we need to take advantage of that sooner in the process rather than later. Um, and so, yeah, it's I see it almost as collaborative design,
Yeah.
co-design, and the boundaries could be internal to the company, external to the company, or I think we could also improve co-design when it comes to vertically within our value chain, or even two different functions within our organization. Like, how can we do our design in a way that helps us get those perspectives sooner? Why do we wait so long
Yeah.
to get feedback and then have to integrate it in a way that is like costly and um, yeah, inefficient?
What do you think? Like, just I mean, the way you just described it, you got multiple functions, you've got the vertical stack, like just different parts of the life cycle and people involved. You got supply chain. Where do you think people should start? Like, if you're really thinking about this, I hear all sorts of opinions on this. What's your perspective on like a good starting place to try and become, let's say, a little less siloed and a little less barrier and a little more engagement early and often? Like, where do you think start has the highest impact and maybe least risk?
Oh man, that's a great question. I think you just have to be opportunistic. Like, I think something that I'm realizing in the work that I do, so we run these experiments to collect data, but we're also looking for organizations to share their perspectives with us. So we'll do like formal research interviews,
Mm-hmm.
for example. And you kind of come across people who get excited about the idea of co-design, and you come across people who aren't.
Yeah.
And I have trouble kind of connecting with those people. I just don't get it. I feel like this is an inevitable shift, and
Mm-hmm.
some people just don't. And so I'm kind of copping out of your question by saying, in the short term, I think the short term win is whatever ally you can make, whether it's like someone on the marketing team who would be excited to give input sooner in a design review, or someone
Mm-hmm.
from, if you're on design, someone from your manufacturing team who has like raised issues with you and said like, you guys need to figure this out sooner. It's like invite them into your design process sooner. Um, yeah, so I think it's all a win.
I think that actually makes sense though, because it's not every company is going to be the same. And I think finding the people who are willing and excited is actually like the critical part of that right now. Because the truth is, like, if you look at research and data and the rest, like, it's hard to deny a lot of these things. But it's emotional, right? It's an emotional choice to make a change. People are stuck doing the way they've done it. They don't have time. There's risk. There's real risk in making that change. But if you really go back to like what companies at a macro scale are trying to do now, which is soon going to be a much different marketplace to work in. The economy is going to be tricky. Retention and attraction of employees are going to be hard. So everything's going to get more competitive. You're going to be expected to deliver faster products to market, better products to market. It's just going to keep getting harder and harder. And to make that jump something has to change at the working level because they're only doing like 3 and 4% improvements right now. And we need like a 50 to 100% improvement sort of year on year. And I think it's undeniable it's going to happen. My question to you is, if you're thinking about those people who get it, who are excited by it and want to do it now and not in 5 years from now, why do you think they're motivated now? Like you mentioned earlier on that the tooling wasn't there really like 4 or 5 years ago even. But what else do you think is kind of driving the push for people to really be questioning, are we working together the right way at this particular point in time in 2022?
I love it. It's a great question. I think I think it might be certainly COVID. I think there's also a push in the broader culture to be more reflective. Um, I think I think in general we kind of have touched on this already, but it feels weird that in our lives
Yeah.
so much of what we do is so collaborative and connected, and then you would come to work and all of a sudden you're siloed. Like I think people are starting to realize like why in my enterprise where we have so many resources are we not taking advantage of
Hmm.
the technology that's like fueling so much of the other tools in our lives that help us feel connected. And if I could kind of elaborate on that, so one of my students, Kathy, and actually, by the way, I should give shout outs. So our two heads better than one paper is from former PhD student Vrushank Fadnis, who did some really great work there.
Nice.
But my student Kathy, who's a current master's student, interviewed 20 designers who are working with CAD, and she asked them about collaborating with CAD. And I think something that surprised us was that every single person, each of those 20 people, had a complaint and a barrier about the current norm of collaborating with CAD. And Kathy said something that I thought was really insightful, which is like these designers are working on solving problems every day, being so thoughtful about the design that they're doing. Um, and yet they're all creatures of habit and have just kind of like accepted the habit
Yeah.
of workarounds to make collaboration happen. And so the contrast was really interesting, like working on world changing technology, super thoughtful on their design, and then when it comes to reflecting on their own workflow and their own process, they just hadn't really
Yeah.
pushed for change. And so it makes sense to me that we are creatures of habit like that, but I
Hmm.
think I'm trying to connect folks to see that they can be more, that there are ways to rethink their process and new ways. So sure, it's a little bit risky, but that I think can help them design better.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Like David Ullman talks a lot about decision making, and sort of like your product is like a summation of all the decisions you've made, sort of throughout that build. And I always come back to because I agree. Like, it's hard to make that shift from something you're comfortable with. And I mean, I did it, 7, 8 years ago, when I was modeling. I got used to it too because I didn't see a light at the end of the tunnel. I think a big part of what's changing now is there is that light at the end of the tunnel, and people realize that it's okay to be yourself at work. And part of that means you expect things more than what you've been given over the last 10 years or last 40 years, really. Because I know when I worked previously in engineering roles, I didn't think much of the tooling. I thought it was totally, this is what it's like to work. Like I actually just spoke to someone who was still using Lotus Notes. I'm like, I would leave a company in a heartbeat. Like the second I walked in, if I found out they were using Lotus Notes, I'd be straight out the door because that is so far behind where teams should be. But I think the same is going to happen in the engineering world. Teams are going to get to a point where it's like, maybe SolidWorks gets to the cloud and Truly gets to the cloud and NX does too, and Creo. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. Maybe there's other tools that bridge the gap. But this whole ecosystem is going to evolve. And those who are cool with it and get used to it are going to have a huge advantage because it's going to help. It's not going to really hinder anybody. It's going to connect this like whole other like force multiplier really behind it. And I'm excited to see that happen. One of the things I'm curious about on like the co-design front, thinking about the CAD piece in particular, because co-design is bigger than just CAD. I think it's engineering as a whole. Like There's a lot to it. On the CAD front, what do you see the outcome likely being? Like I think right now it's very siloed between the companies that provide CAD tools. Yet every company who builds something has a mix of SolidWorks and NX and Creo and everything in their supply chain. Do you see them ever like really becoming buddies and connecting it all together? Do you think there's going to be middleware layers? Like where do you see this ending up on the tooling front of the co-design question?
Yeah. Well, I wish I could predict the future like that. Right now, I feel like there's going to be middleware. I feel um, like there are just so many reasons that a company gets really committed to a tool.
Yeah.
Um, and so it in the long term there might be change, but in the even the medium term, I don't think there's going to be. But I think building on what you're actually just saying, the shift generally towards being more collaborative. I also think new graduates joining the workforce and sort of demanding it is going to mean that there's either going to have to be like new features from the big players, or there's going to be niche spots to fill for other software programs that help us be more collaborative. Yeah, because I will say too, like here at the university, I see young people learning CAD, and for example, if we talk about Onshape again, like the students are so used to Google Docs.
Yeah.
That they see Onshape and it's just like a direct translation for them, and there's almost like no discomfort. They're just totally natural in it, which is really interesting to see.
It's a SaaS thing, really. Like, if you look at any software as a service, they've all been. I see so much literature about. Think about all the companies that exist to give you ways to spin up databases and automate notifications. Like they literally have built companies to make SaaS products almost identical, and it's partially for good reason, right? It means the experience is going to be kind of synchronous across whatever application, and you get used to. There's always a button up here where you can go chat with someone. There's always a notification where you can go live, get to something. You expect everything to be tracked automatically. Like your expectations change. And I think it's a really important shift, because if you don't have to think about what tool you're using, in my opinion, that's winning. Like I think that's actually winning for engineers and their teams is go do your thing. Forget about the tools, but the tools should be there to support you and not be, your enemy or your champion. Like they're really just there to kind of be on that playing field. And one thing I'm really curious about, like just thinking about, engineers working together, you talked a little bit about finding the champions that you can kind of get and make this work, find an ally who, you start with on the collaborative front. One thing we're hearing lots about is teams moving away from drawings, paper, all the rest, really want to embrace 3D, but even going beyond that, like the big players, the Fortune 500s are looking at like truly model-based definition, but they're seeing a lot of pushback from supply chain in particular, and how to get there. Do you see MBD becoming mainstream? And if so, like, are we talking a year, 5 years, 10 years, never? Like, what's your perspective on like how it goes from, engineers working in silos to engineers working together to engineers working together without a whole bunch of other information straight all over the place?
Yeah. Well, I guess as we chip away at the problem and we kind of streamline some of the other issues of collaboration and get used to them. Like I think something that is fundamentally a problem is the authoritative source of information. And the folks in my community who study design research talk about that often. Like building a shared understanding is really important. And so what is the single source of truth is what we talked about for a while. I see MBD as a way to get there. I think I would love for you to get like an organizational change person on the podcast, because I'm a mechanical engineer and I don't exactly have the understanding of all of the inertia that happens to block folks from shifting there. But to me, if we started from scratch and had no existing commitments to anything, like I think MBD would be the way to go. And so I hope it happens or I imagine I will see it happen in like 10 years. I think it'll be more prevalent in 5 years. Maybe we'll see a big shift, which could happen if like something like the U.S.
Yeah.
government says like, oh, there must be MBD or something. That's what's really caused a lot of the big shifts in tooling and in standards and stuff. But until that happens, I think we'll just slowly see a trickle of folks and maybe sort of like an yeah, like a split industry. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think it's until it becomes a requirement either contractually from like the owner of a supply chain or a regulatory body or some big government, like it's gonna be slow, I think. Until it's not slow. And then it's gonna be really fast and people aren't gonna be ready and it's gonna be a whole other source of pain. Um, I'm curious, like in like wrapping all this up and thinking about collaboration, the work your team's doing, where is this going, people working together. What are you most excited to study in 2022? Like, what's the thing you're trying to figure out here that you think is gonna, be super exciting for us to come back here and talk about in 12 months' time?
Okay, well, I think I'll give two answers. One thing that I'm really excited about is this question of beyond two heads. How many heads can we have working on a CAD model, and what happens when we have many people working? Like I think there's been such interesting large crowdsourced software projects. There hasn't really been the same thing when it comes to hardware.
Hmm.
I would love to see it. The power of the crowd has been shown to be really creative sometimes and really effective at problem solving, and so better understanding that in a CAD context would be really interesting. The other thing that we're pretty interested in studying in my lab is creativity in and CAD.
Mm.
So there's some I'll say older studies that that describe how CAD may not be the most effective tool for doing conceptual design because it hinders creativity.
Hmm.
And that's something that you kind of mentioned earlier, Adam, is like the tool should be an extension of the designer. It
Yeah.
shouldn't be a blocker of the designer. And so folks thought that sketching is certainly an extension of the designer, but in like the early 2000s when folks were writing these papers and doing the comparisons, the CAD was not an extension of the designer. I think it's time to revisit that, but also to have this other perspective in it, which is what about if we don't look singularly at one designer doing the CAD modeling? What if we allow some collaboration, whether it's like multi-tenant or even just in some other way allowing two designers or more to work together? Um, can we see the same types of creativity happening that we see in sketching? Um,
Ha-
so yeah.
have you checked out Shaper 3D? Oh, you need to go check it out. Shaper 3D is like iPad CAD, and it's gone now onto desktop. But the founders and team are amazing. But it basically has taken away like the typical CAD constraints, where the whole time you're making CAD models, you're thinking about, how do I make the CAD model, not how do I make it feel like the thing? Because like when you're talking about conceptual design, I've heard this before from people talking about clay molding or just like getting on the whiteboard and sketching. It literally is that. Like, you start with the Apple Pencil on an iPad, and like if you wanted to like pull a fillet, like you actually would just grab the line and pull it with the pencil, like exactly how you'd expect. Like if you wanted to like extrude something, you draw a circle and pull it out. Like, you know what I mean? It feels like how your brain would work if you had it in your hands. You should check it out. I think your lab would have an incredible time digging in. It's like a wicked tool. They actually just launched like visualization. Like I saw a demo video of someone sketching up in like 5 minutes a pair of headphones and then throwing the visualization on top of it, and it looked really good in a 5 minute demo. But I think it'd be really cool for some research.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. I'll definitely look it up.
Awesome. Alison, thanks so much for joining. I really appreciate the insights, and I'm really looking forward to just seeing how many heads are on this monster at the end of the day for people working together, and what the ideal way is for teams to behave. So thanks so much.